and Betty and the Nancys and Bills and Joes and Janes will find in the study of science a richer, more rewarding life.
Hey, welcome to Inquiring Minds. I'm Indre. This is a podcast that explores the space where science and society collide. We want to find out what's true, what's left to discover, and why it matters. A few months ago, I was at a dinner party, and I had the good fortune of sitting next to an evolutionary biologist who could comment on the molecular chemistry of the food we were consuming. And you can imagine all the ways in which this could have gone wrong. But in Noah Whiteman's case, he managed to entertain while educating, and we played the fun game of Guess the Spice, which he won handily and then could also tell us how that particular spice evolved. So I had to share his expertise with you, my listeners, and fellow nerds at Inquiring Minds. Noah Whiteman is professor of integrative biology and of molecular and cell biology at UC Berkeley. He's a Guggenheim Fellow, and we're going to talk about his book, Most Delicious Poison, The Story of Nature's Toxins from Spices to Vices. Noah, welcome to Inquiring Minds.
Indre, thank you so much. It's great to be here. And I loved your description of the dinner. I had similar memories.
Yeah, it was among the nerdier events that we had over the winter time, but also super fun. Or I guess, I shouldn't say also. It was super fun in part because it was super nerdy. But one of the things that I wanted to start with is your own research, and let's start with the monarch butterfly. Tell us about your work with monarchs.
Yeah, so we became interested with some collaborators in trying to understand how the monarch butterfly is able to resist very potent heart poisons that it actually stores in its body. And it does this because when baby monarch caterpillars are born, they're born on milkweed plants because their mothers laid their eggs on that plant. And the caterpillars only feed on these milkweed plants that are called milkweeds because they contain this sap, this white sap that is loaded with these heart poisons that are called cardiac glycosides. And similar heart poisons are found in foxglove plants, which are in a different lineage. So these toxins evolved independently many times in plants. And these little caterpillars, get their zebra stripes, and they're able to not only resist the toxins and use the leaves of the milkweed and flower buds and flowers themselves as a food source, but then they store those toxins in their body and carry them through metamorphosis so that when the adult monarch butterfly emerges, it is carrying these heart poisons from the plant in its body. And it keeps them in its body through its adult life, including in the Eastern North American population during the migration of those that are born in late fall, and say, Southern Ontario or Minnesota. Those butterflies, those monarchs, make their way down to these mountains in Mexico where they overwinter, and they're protected from bird attack by these chemicals that are in their bodies. They act as a chemical shield. So the big question was, most caterpillars, most animals cannot eat milkweed. If they did, they would vomit. So there's an emetic effect. And if they did continue, they would eventually perish because these toxins target a particular pump in our cells that is critical for moving sodium across cell membrane. So somehow these monarchs have the ability to sort of block the toxin from binding. And so what we did is we decided to use CRISPR gene editing to turn the fruit fly's sodium pump gene into the monarch butterfly's sodium pump gene and then feed the toxin to the fruit flies. And we did that by very precisely editing the DNA of the fruit fly, and then put the toxin in fly food, which is like spent yeast. And it turned out that those fruit flies that we call monarch flies were completely resistant to levels of the heart poison that would kill a room full of elephants. So the flies were completely unperturbed when they carried just 3 mutations that had evolved in the monarch butterfly. And that sort of resolved how the monarch was able to resist the hard poisons that is necessary for its own survival.
I mean, it's interesting to see that it's tied to these three genes, and that sort of gives us a sense of how it was possible for it to evolve this specific response. But it also makes me wonder kind of how rare that is in nature, where, I mean, there are lots of examples of this kind of war between a toxin that a plant creates and the animal that consumes it. And then there's symbiotic relationships where, there are animals that are friendly to the plant because they spread its seeds. And so, et cetera. So can you give us an overview of how common it is that it would be like relatively few genes involved versus a long-standing set of smaller steps, perhaps, before the animal gets to that state?
Yeah, I think both things are true. I think that in order to overcome these toxins, many different kinds of adaptations can be sort of shifted or created by evolution, by natural selection. And probably the first ones are sort of like they're better at resisting it. Maybe it's not perfectly resistant to
Hmm.
it, but they get a little better. Maybe they can pump out the toxin faster, right? So instead of actually blocking it, maybe they can just kind of get rid of it, excrete it faster. So that's probably one way. And so there's like these stages. They go from resistance to eventually co-opting and sequestering the toxin, because many of these insects don't sequester. They're just able to feed, sometimes barely able to feed. And so I do think it's both things. And we see that gradual step, even with these three mutations, they occurred stepwise over the
Hmm.
course of millions of years. And so we can see that by retracing the evolutionary history of them using phylogenetic trees. And so that's one part of it. Um, the other piece is thinking about these chemicals like caffeine that can actually be used by plants in very different ways. And so sometimes they serve as insecticides. Caffeine is a great insecticide. So it's loaded into the leaves of tea plants and into the coffee berries of coffee plants, where it serves to protect them from enemies. But coffee plants also put it in their nectar of the flowers, and that actually has a reinforcing positive effect on bees that visit those plants, so that they
Hmm.
recruit their sisters back to those plants. They remember where those plants are better. They have a sort of enhanced odor memory reward. And that's because the caffeine levels that are in the nectar are just below the bitter rejection threshold of the bees.
Hmm.
And so it has this kind of same effect it has on us, on the bee's brain. And that's a positive thing for the plant in both cases, as a defense in the leaves against chewing
Hmm.
caterpillars, and in the berries against the beetles, say, or things like that in the coffee berries. And then on the plant, on the flower side, they want insects to visit those, the right ones. So they kind of use the chemical, to their own devices, both as a positive and negative kind of interactor with these animals. And that is also kind of what we do with these chemicals at some level.
I mean, I think for the most part, people have this notion that yes, there might be some elements or some toxins in plants that are potentially fatal or really damaging to smaller animals. But I'm a big mammal, and so I can eat a little bit of it and get a bit of that, and that's sort of why, caffeine or some of these other toxins have become recreational drugs for us. It is like, is that kind of a general principle, or from reading your book, I got the impression that actually the story's a lot more interesting than that, in terms of it's not just about dosage, but it's also sort of how animals interact with the plants, which I hadn't really quite appreciated before.
Yes, I think that's right. When we think about the evolution of these things and where plants are putting these, how much they're putting, what types and what tissues and where, that has all been selected for by the animals and the microbes that are attacking them. And also from the perspective of the plant, as I said, sometimes they can attract using these chemicals too. And of course, we know that every time we walk by a flower and you smell its beautiful fragrance, it's like that's attractive to bees, for example.
Hmm.
So plants are these, chemical factories, but it's not just sort of willy nilly. They're investing very carefully in particular chemicals to their own advantage, and we come in and tapped into those resources ourselves. But we're animals, just like the bees, and so you might not think that we have a lot in common with something like a bee, but we do. there's only so many ways to make a brain, right? Brains probably evolved once at the base of animals. And so, because of that, our shared heritage means that we can tap into these chemicals that evolved way before humans were around, yet they can affect us in many of the same ways. But as you said, because we're bigger, in the grand scheme of things, humans are huge as animals. Because of that, the same dose that would kill a caterpillar would allow me to be a little bit happier in the morning of caffeine. So both things are true at the same time. It's targeting the same adenosine receptors, but it's having a different impact because of how big we are. And so, but as you said, it's not just the dose. For example, Botox, which is probably the most deadly toxin out there, is botulinum toxin that is produced by bacteria. It's really deadly. It kills millions of birds every year. But we use it as a cosmetic, but also as a pharmaceutical to treat different disorders of muscle. And so, depending on where that's injected and how it's ingested, it can be either this kind of curative thing that's sort of trivial or deadly. And so, you're exactly right that it's not just the dose; it's where that toxin is delivered, and many other features, subtle features that determine its fate in us.
And one of the things too I always love thinking about is that, like, so the coffee plant is a good example of a plant that we also now cultivate because it's so good. So you could argue that there is this that there's this success story of this plant because we as humans have actually created so much more of it because of this toxin.
Absolutely. And, that's something Michael Pollan talks about in the
Hmm.
Botany of Desire. And, in his case, he's talking about things like potatoes and corn, and tomatoes that are grown all over the world. But they, of course, originated from one spot. And, the coffee that we use, the Arabica beans, they arose in the Ethiopian highlands. That's where they evolved. Now they're everywhere in the
Hmm.
tropics. They're on the island of Hawaii, the islands of
Hmm.
Hawaii, the most isolated islands in the world, and every continent except Antarctica is growing coffee pretty much. So there's an example of, like, these things have become dependent on us, but they've also, from their perspective, are very successful evolutionarily now. And so I think you're right. They're crops, and they're co-evolving with us. So, and I say that because, in the book I talk about how caffeine consumption is associated with, reduced depression risk by about, 20% for people who drink 4 cups a day or more. There's about a 20% drop in depression risk, and about a 50% drop in suicide risk. These are studies of healthcare professionals that were, of course, prone to selection bias. They're not double blind, placebo controlled, but they are longitudinal studies showing that there's this association that may be causal. We don't know. But there's an example of, like, that's a huge benefit for human
Hmm.
fitness, right? And the plants are also really benefiting from our planting them all over the place from an evolutionary perspective. So I think you're right.
One of the other things I find really interesting is that there are plants that can hear. So when they hear the particular sound of a predator caterpillar crunching or munching when it's played for them, they release toxins into the air.
Yes.
Yeah, tell us. I mean, that was shocking to me when I read about that.
That was
Thinking about.
yeah, that was shocking to me too. I knew that, for example, some insects, like these cute little tree hoppers, that have piercing mouth parts that drink the juice of plants in the tropics, the mothers kind of protect their babies, the little nymphs that are around them, and they can communicate by sticking their proboscis into the stem of the plant, and they can kind of shake themselves and communicate to their babies that might be somewhere else
Hmm.
on the stem. So they're using the plant to make sound, but the plant is apparently eavesdropping on that too. And
Hmm.
so, plants are I don't want to use the word clever because, of course, we're anthropomorphizing. They don't
Right.
have brains, but they're very sensitive to their environments. They've evolved the ability to perceive all kinds of light signals, of course. And plants, anybody who knows, who has plants at home, knows that they move. Plants move
Hmm.
their leaves, they turn their leaves, they turn their stems, they grow towards light. They try to escape neighbors, right? To shade out
Hmm.
neighbors. They can perceive neighbors that are wounded by other enemies. So, say an insect attacks a neighboring plant, that plant will release volatiles. Those
Hmm.
can be picked up by a neighboring plant in the air, and then that plant can induce a defense response and increase its toxin production itself in anticipation of those enemies. So plants, are sitting ducks, and so they've evolved escape mechanisms from danger, just like we have. Except in our case, we run. We have immune systems. They can't run. They have a different kind of immune system that is heavily reliant on these chemicals.
Yeah, and I think that's also a fascinating direction. So, tell us more about this immune system, and is there a way for us to harness it? In some of our own. I mean, we always talk about plant toxins or chemicals as being potential drugs, and so can we learn something about how their immune systems work that might even enhance our own?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting that plants have evolved something called innate immunity independently, probably, of animals, and but they sometimes recognize the same enemies. So, for example, bacterial cells, move around using a tail called the flagellum, and these flagella are sort of these whip-like things that are allowing bacteria to move through liquids, and pieces of those tails fall off. And it turns out that if I injected myself with flagellin, which is just a small part of that molecule, I would have this huge immune response
Hmm.
immediately within minutes that would be very effective at preventing bacteria from colonizing, say, my blood if I had a break in the skin or something. And plants do the same thing. So you can take that same flagellin molecule, inject it into a plant leaf through the stomata, the openings, and that plant will mount an immune response against bacteria also immediately. But they've evolved independently the ability to perceive that molecule. So the receptors are completely different, yet they
Hmm.
do the same thing. They result in the same thing. And this makes sense. They're multicellular organisms just like we are. They have evolved to protect themselves from these microbes and also from insects. So I have colleagues who have identified proteins in the saliva of caterpillars that if you wipe on a plant leaf, the plant will immediately mount an immune response.
Hmm.
Again, kind of similar to, say, a mosquito injecting its proteins into your body, right? And you have this little
Hmm.
immune reaction around the mosquito bite.
Hmm.
So there's all these parallels. And because of that, plants can be very useful models for understanding innate immunity and how it evolves, how it works. And people usually don't care what you do to a plant, which makes them a little bit easier to study than, say, like a mouse, which people really do care about what you do to it. So, from that perspective, they're great models. But then the other side of it is that some of the chemicals that are turned on during these defense responses turn out to be actually drugs that we can tap into. And a great example is Taxol, which comes from the Pacific yew tree, and that is used to treat cancer right now. People's lives are being
Hmm.
saved because they're getting Taxol, which evolved not for us. We didn't breed the plants to do this. Um, it probably evolved as a defense against natural enemies. And so we're tapping into the ultimate products of this innate immune system to our own advantage.
So that also brings this question to me that I've been wondering about, which is, we hear about there, the deepest parts of the ocean are less explored than the moon, for example. We know less about it, even though it's on our own planet, and there are all these organisms that can live and thrive there, and from them we can actually discover new drugs and new ways of helping our own health. But it makes me wonder, as we go into a world where we have generative artificial intelligence, where we have all of these tools, like, are we getting to a point where we no longer need to discover new chemicals? We can imagine them, or we can create them with these very sophisticated statistical models? Or are we still learning a lot from these undiscovered places as we interact with these organisms?
Yeah, I would say it's somewhere in between. And that's probably what the future holds as well. Because I think the thing with generative AI, if you really think about it, the models are trained on data now that we have, right? So
Hmm.
the creative aspect, I think, is actually the biggest challenge, the truly creative
Hmm.
aspect. Um, and evolution, 4.5 billion years of evolution, is, I would say, a lot more powerful tool to
Hmm.
leverage than some AI machinery that has come to life in the last few years.
Okay,
So,
yeah, good point.
but having said that, I just read a paper where a new class of antibiotics was discovered through sort of AI. And so I
Hmm.
do think that there's tremendous potential there. But if you just look at the facts right now, over half of the anti-cancer drugs on the market are from nature or inspired directly from natural molecules. So even though there's a lot of like platinum-based chemotherapies that are synthetic, that's true. The new ones will be derived from kind of small molecule invention through either AI or things like directed evolution, which actually kind of uses microbes as factories and uses evolution as a tool in a synthetic way. So that's also kind of a hybrid between the two things we were just talking about. But then just the natural products like childhood leukemia, many cases that would have been fatal have been, many children's lives have been saved by chemicals from the Madagascar periwinkle,
Hmm.
and so vinblastine is one example of a chemical that is still used to treat leukemia and other blood cancers. So I think that if you really think deeply about it, both are going to be needed in order to advance medicine. And because of that, there's still so much potential in for natural products, I think, for human health. And those habitats where most of the chemicals are tropical rainforests. And those are the most endangered habitats pretty much in the world. And so if you
Hmm.
think about these things, they're all kind of connected. And so where are those lands? They're indigenous lands primarily. They're primarily in the tropics. That's where most of the biodiversity is, far more than in the oceans. So the
Hmm.
diversity of life on land is far exceeds that in the oceans, even based on what people are guessing to be, would be a best case scenario for how diverse things are in the oceans. And so
Hmm.
that's also kind of interesting to think about. And I think you're right. There's all this unexplored stuff underwater. It's really important, potential microbes under there. But these rainforests, these tropical regions on land, are really where the sort of the biodiversity engine runs at its highest. And that is where a lot of these chemicals are sitting there. Will they be there in 20 years?
Hmm.
Will someone discover the thing in 20 years? That's the question for us to answer.
I think though one of the underappreciated elements here as, is that okay, so you might have a scientist or a biologist that's cataloging a new species, but then you need to go from that to what is the chemical that this species produces that no one other species produce, and how can it be harnessed for human health? And so, can you tell us how that generally works? Is it a lot of serendipity? Is it about like, well, there's this kind of strategic way of looking at the mechanisms of a new chemical? Is it when you discover a new species, how often is there also a new chemical involved versus that's actually kind of a rarity? Tell us about that aspect.
Well, that those were so many good layered questions there, but they are all interrelated. And I can at least start with this notion that most of the chemicals that get into the Western medicine pharmacopoeia, I would call it,
Hmm.
um, that is our modern set of drugs. And if you look at where those came from or where those come from, most of them come from folk knowledge and indigenous knowledge. They're
Hmm.
plants that are being tapped into already by
Hmm.
local people and indigenous people that get pulled in. One example are the heart poisons I described, cardiac glycosides that came from one set foxglove. That was the first clinical trial done by William Withering in the 18th century was to treat congestive heart failure. A little bit of that cardiac glycoside actually can strengthen cardiac contractions so it can cure congestive heart failure. And that came from, in his words, an old woman from Shropshire had a recipe that she was using to treat people. And he
Hmm.
pulled foxglove out of that and isolated it and sort of looked at it. That kind of thing is what has happened in many, many different cases of drugs that we use now. And that is, I would say, where the future is as well. So the local
Hmm.
indigenous knowledge where there's been trial and error and people are using these plants for lots of different reasons. And studies have been done actually looking at this objectively. Where do the drugs come from? Is it just if I took a transect across the rainforest, would I find the drugs in the pharmacopoeia versus
Hmm.
what we know these local people know? And the answer is it's most of the plants are plants that local people know and use.
Hmm.
Um, and so it's a human, there's a human element in the filtering process already. Now, there have been projects that have sort of done what I proposed, the transect method, where you would bring plants in, extract them, and just put them through a brute force approach. Not that many drugs have come to the fore that way. And so I do think that, even though it sounds like that should work well, it's actually quite hard. But the second part of it, which is, how often do you find a new chemical? The way I would think about it is these plants often have a set of chemicals that evolved a long time ago, and they all make, various versions of that. Like all milkweeds, and there are hundreds of species, make cardiac glycosides, but they'll make slightly different ones. And those ones may have different activities. They may be more or less water soluble. They may be, better, easier to get across like a cell membrane through fat. So those tweaks actually can be extremely important in determining whether something has a pharmaceutical activity that's useful or not. So, when we think about these things, we got to think about them as evolutionary traits, like the capacity to evolve cardiac glycosides, and then the tweaking and diversification that happens. So each plant order, roughly, which is just a lineage of plant, a broad lineage, kind of has a different set of chemicals that they've evolved the ability to make. And so that, like the opium poppy makes morphine. Those morphin alkaloids, their sort of derivatives are found in all kinds of different poppies. Maybe not morphine, but things like them. So, there's a general classification scheme that kind of can mirror the evolutionary history.
So your example of some of these serendipitous discoveries, or at least looking at, people as they're using them, reminded me of one of the most vivid pictures I have after reading your book. And it's in the chapter that made me, solidified the sense that you and I are going to be friends. Because you start out by saying, that Sydney in Downton Abbey died, and of course she was the best character. Like that was the end of Downton Abbey for me. I was like, well, you're going to kill her off. That's it, right?
Lady Sybil. Lady
Sybil. Sorry, Lady Sybil. Yes, she was the best. And then it all went downhill from there. And we'll talk about the preeclampsia in a minute. But it was the 9-year-old boy, I think, who ate toad eggs. Like I can't get that out of my head.
Yeah.
So tell us about this.
Yeah. So in the book, that's in one of the chapters where I'm talking about cardiac glycosides. What's amazing is that animals have also evolved the ability to make cardiac glycosides. And toads are one of them, and they store them in the glands behind their head, the big glands. When you look at a toad, you can't miss them. They're called the parotid glands. And say a dog or a fox came by, or raccoon, and bit that toad, immediately it would discharge this milky substance, like the milkweed, and in that would be the cardiac glycosides. And so if that raccoon ate that toad, it would be poisoned by the chemical. So usually they spit them out, and the toad might live to see another day. But what's amazing is that these cane toads, which are invasive in Australia, they put those cardiac glycosides in their eggs. So, and actually monarch butterflies do this too. They load their eggs up with the cardiac glycosides from the host plant. In the case of the toad, the most amazing thing is the toads are synthesizing the cardiac glycosides themselves. So they don't need to get it from a plant. They're making it. And so they make this homemade heart poison that they're resistant to, by the way. They've evolved similar mutations to the monarch that prevents their sodium pump from binding to it. But they put it in their eggs as a protectant from being eaten by, say, fish in the pond or the stream. This little kid, this 9-year-old Australian boy, is walking by a stream, playing in the stream, sees these eggs, and who knows what the backstory is, where his friends daring him to do it. Well, you can imagine. And he eats some of these eggs. So then, maybe an hour or two later, his mother notices that he's turning blue. He has something called cyanosis, which is a sign that the heart is not working. So he ended up going into kind of this major cardiac emergency. Luckily, they brought him to the hospital, and they have an antidote for this. And the antidote is because they inject sheep with this heart poison, and then there's an antibody against the heart poison that is produced by the sheep. They purify that, and they can give that as a cure, and it works really well. So it binds to the poison in your blood, saved his life.
Yeah. Amazing story. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the story of the kid eating the toad eggs.
Yes. Well, so let's get back to how this relates to Lady Sybil.
Right. Okay, so there's a very tenuous, strange link. And I should preface this by saying this is still a fertile area for research and is
Mhm.
controversial.
Yeah.
So I mentioned that toads make cardiac glycosides, but there is evidence that all mammals also do in very small amounts make either cardiac glycosides or chemicals that sort of act like them on the sodium pump, which is the target. And that, why would we do this? Well, the message of the book is some chemicals are both toxins and drugs at the same time. And that
Mhm.
includes sometimes even things that we make. And so it could be thought of as a hormone that we're using to regulate sort of our body's physiology. And there is some evidence that preeclampsia, which is this very complex disorder that occurs during pregnancy, where there's a set of symptoms that kind of go together, including hypertension, kind of kidney problems, and issues with the placental implantation. That's usually what it arises from. And there's some evidence that there's elevated levels of cardiac glycosides in the blood of people who are pregnant and have preeclampsia. So the suggestion was that possibly this is either a consequence or a cause of the preeclampsia is our a misregulation or sort of too much production of these homemade cardiac glycosides, endogenous cardiac glycosides. And so
And I,
that's why I opened that chapter with like pregnancy and parotid glands, trying to connect the two things.
and
Because
yeah, and it's a real problem. I think the statistic you cite is like 8% of pregnant women can go through preeclampsia. It is like one of the leading causes of maternal mortality. It's pretty scary.
it's really
Um,
scary. And, in developing countries, of course, and,
mhm,
lower socioeconomic bands, it's more of a problem. And, in the developing world, it's a huge issue. And
mhm.
so the question of why, and, could you use something like this antibody, to treat
Yeah.
people with it? Some companies have actually pursued that a little bit. But I think the jury's still out as to
Mhm,
whether we really make this chemical or something like it. And it's very clear something's going on in our blood that is binding to the sodium pump and preventing it from working. The question is, what is it? And it's
mhm.
kind of cool that we don't know the answer.
And also, why does it happen during pregnancy and, all
Yeah,
of those,
exactly.
other elements. A lot of
Exactly.
hormonal changes going on at that time. So, let's get back to the dinner party and the spices. One of the questions I had for you was, so we discover, new drugs potentially in this, in this way. Do you think that there is a market for, or like a place for us to discover new food flavors that maybe some of this biodiversity is allowing us to do, or do you feel like we've in the million plus years of human evolution, we've pretty much tasted everything and decided what is good to eat and what isn't?
It's such an interesting question. If you go into like a spice rack, say in Tokyo, into someone's house, if you went into my cabinet, if you went into someone's house in say Peru, or say in Fiji, or say in New Zealand, would you find a similar set of chemicals? And on average, you would. You'd find a
Hmm.
similar set of spices. Now they're sort of like the plants we cultivate. They're pan world. They're pan tropical. And on the other hand, if you went into, say, a spice rack in India, you'd probably find more than you normally would, say, in the United States. So there is a set, there's a common set, and then I would say there's a local set on top of that of somewhat obscure things. And that's the part that I think appeals to broadening our palate a little bit. And it's kind of like the drug thing. It's very similar. It's the stuff local people are using. And if it's hard to grow or say it's only found in the wild, well, it's going to be restricted then to a particular place, but it could be some wonderful new spice. So I think that we limit ourselves by thinking of spices only as this very limited set. I think that's a travesty.
Hmm.
And I think we should, you're right. I mean, I think there is a market there. That's a great idea to expand the reach, like what are all the spices,
Hmm.
flavorings used by people around the world? That's a kind of a fascinating question, and I'm not sure it's been answered.
And what
And
what go sorry, go ahead.
no, I was gonna say, and what if some of those were actually easy to cultivate? The
Mhm.
obscure things that all of a sudden there's a new sense, there's a new combination. I think that's part of it. It's the tingling and the taste,
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
smell and the,
Mm-hmm.
pungency. It's usually a combination of things. It's not any one thing that makes a spice really special, in my opinion.
And but there are different qualities of spices. So one of my favorite stores in San Francisco, which went out of business sadly, was the store where you could actually have a kind of a horizontal tasting of different cinnamons,
Oh,
Thai cinnamon and Vietnamese cinnamon, and like from these different like terroirs of cinnamon, and
yeah,
they actually
cool.
tasted remarkably different. And so, that also made me wonder, like, if you have this same plant and it has these different terroirs, does it taste different because the chemical composition is pretty significantly different? Or, is there like, yeah, I mean, what is,
Absolutely. So, like, I would say two things. One is, there's genetic variation for the production of different types, specific types of molecules, even if they're in the same class. So that could give you a different bouquet or
Mhm.
cocktail. Even if it was the same species of plant, they were somewhat divergent populations. That's one thing. The other thing is, if a plant is attacked, say, by herbivores, it will mount a defense response by upregulating the production of those chemicals. So
Hmm.
it can be more pungent, even though they're the same flavors, or some of them will go up in abundance, but not others. And so each plant individual could have a different profile depending on its experience as a plant
Hmm.
and its evolutionary history. So, yes. And I think, we're so, what is the right word? Stunted in our sort of sensitivities because we're given these spices by these big companies, right? And
Hmm.
they want to make it uniform so that when you get cinnamon, you know it's
Hmm.
cinnamon. Well, it would be nice to maybe be surprised every now and then, as you're saying, by something new, just like we would go to a wine tasting. I love that idea, a cinnamon
Yeah.
taste.
I mean, it was really remarkable how different. And then one of my favorite chocolate makers here is Dandelion Chocolate, and all of their chocolates have exactly the same composition. It's, cocoa plus sugar plus I think maybe one more ingredient I can't remember, but it was like, so you can again do this tasting where everything is kept constant except where the bean is coming from,
Oh, I see.
and it's remarkable how different the flavors are. So if you want to continue to nerd out, for our listeners, I recommend you pick up Noah Whiteman's book, Most Delicious Poison, The Story of Nature's Toxins from Spices to Vices, which is now available everywhere. And Noah, I'm looking forward to our next dinner party. What's next in your research agenda?
Well, I was going to say, I'm looking forward to chocolate tasting with you at some point.
Yes, let's do it.
um, yeah, so next on our research agenda, we are interested in understanding why plants, fungi, and some animals make natural psychedelic molecules. We
Hmm.
think that they do that to manipulate animals and perhaps as chemical defenses. And so that's something that we're exploring.
Yeah.
And my next book is going to be about light and color and our perception of that as a species and in general in terms of life on Earth.
Wow. Well, that's quite the divergent path, and but I guess still in line with the how we sense the world, as we go
Exactly.
into a new way to think about it. So Noah Whiteman, thank you for being on Inquiring Minds.
Thank you so much, Indre. It was a pleasure.
So that's it for another episode. Thanks for listening. And if you want to hear more, don't forget to subscribe. If you'd like to get an ad-free version of the show, consider supporting us at patreon.com/inquiringminds. I want to especially thank David Noel, Herring Cheng, Yushi Lin, Jay Henry, Joel, and Charles Blyle. Inquiring Minds is produced by Why Not Alchemy. I'm your host, Indre Viscontis. See you next time.